Well, hello folks, welcome back to it. If you've been following this channel for some time, you will have noticed that I was wooed and impressively enamored by the Wandering Village. Also, side note, don't let this clip that I'm showing you fool you, okay? I do reply to comments, but they got erased when I made this channel into a brand channel a few months ago, and then when you do that, they delete old comments. Why is that important information, you ask? Well, special thanks to Strayfon Studios for giving me free access to the game. They were also incredibly kind and gifted us 2 free Steam keys. So let's say the first 2 comments on this video will get a key. And while you're at it, tell me what you're most excited about for the Wandering Village. Easy peasy, get to typing, slap that keyboard. Okay, now early access review time. On September 14th in the year of our Soul Cycle, Strayfon Studios released their anticipated game, The Wandering Village, a game that, as aforementioned, I was super excited about. And what pulled me in was not only their initial artwork, although doubly incredible, but mainly it was because of my experience with their previous game, Niche. Now, without going into too much detail, Niche is a genetics survival game that combines biology, adaptation, and natural selection as part of its gameplay mechanics. I found it to be an addictively good time, so much so that I made a Let's Play series of it. I'll place a link to it down below. I know, super smooth plug.
Clap if you've ever wanted to kill somebody.
So when I heard that Strayfon Studios was embarking into the colony survival genre, I was excited. I am excited because it looked amazing, interesting, and unique, and it is all those things. And as surmised in the thumbnail, the Wandering Village has plenty of potential. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about what is the Wandering Village. For the uninitiated, the Wandering Village is a game about symbiosis in a world nearing the apocalypse, or perhaps already enduring one, where survivors called the Neomans seek shelter from a poisonous fog that slowly infects the world around them, turning neighboring biomes uninhabitable. You're tasked with helping a small group of wandering villagers who so fortunately stumble upon a roaming Colossus named Onbu. And this Colossus so graciously welcomes your villagers on its back. Your goal is to wander, survive, and hopefully thrive by building a living ecosystem on Onbu's back. From a lore and artistic style, you can see where it draws inspiration from Studio Ghibli's works and pulls from Strayfon Studios' previous experiences with their prior mentioned game, Niche, and the science of the natural world guides a lot of the Wandering Village's gameplay, and we see it artistically expressed throughout this game. This is exampled by how their research tree unlocks resources that are renewable and meant to work toward an ecosystem. Also, where most colony survival simulations would have you stake out a piece of land, hold up there, build infrastructure, and endure, the Wandering Village, as the name implies, has you wander on Onbu's back. Onbu needs to eat, migrate, sleep, and survive the poisonous fog just like you do, and so you're tasked with managing both the colony and keeping Onbu alive. As you feed Onbu, pet it, and heal it, Onbu begins to listen to your commands to either run, walk, lay down, and even allow you to choose its routes for it. This can be helpful when avoiding disaster areas such as a poisonous forest or tornadoes, or even running through scorching hot sand dunes. There is a developing trust system in place, and while a bit bare bones in early access, there's a lot to like about this mechanic. Aside from the obvious survival aspect that the trust system brings, further interactions with Onbu can lead to amazing immersion mechanics between the player and the creature. You know, I can see this aspect of the game turning into something where we treat Onbu perhaps less as a pet and more as a peer, or as the game develops more down the line, as seen from their prior illustrations from the dev team, there could be more Colossuses, plural, to be introduced, and players may find themselves really bonding with a certain creature over another. Perhaps there's stats or base area building meta that comes into play in that regard. But rounding out my point, building a base on a moving creature opens a new and inventive way to think about the colony survival sim genre. What we have in early access is just that. The basic conceptual premise ready on delivery. It's in a good functional state that is both playable and engaging, and again, for lack of better words, filled with plenty of potential. The phrase of the video, I know, but as I played through the game, that's kind of where my mind is when thinking about this review. For example, when thinking about how to reinforce the idea of symbiosis, how do they replicate that through gameplay? Well, just to mention a few, there's a gameplay loop that involves you taking Onbu's feces, turning that into a resource called biogas, and then using that to have your decontaminators burn away poisonous plants that grow and weaken Onbu. Similarly, you can take bile from Onbu's gallbladder to create an adjacent substance to then convert that into fire. However, when you take from Onbu's gallbladder, you're causing harm to Onbu, which both erodes its health and its trust in your villagers. So the slower process of manufacturing biogas, while not all the time efficient, allows you to passively gather the resource you need for the game's biggest challenges, which is surviving the deathly toxic plants that pollute the world. However, if you're in a really tight squeeze and for whatever reason you need bile ASAP, you're forced to consider drawing from Onbu's health to save it and your colony from the infectious spread of poisonous plants, and it's in that loop where this game really shines. Building a base on a moving creature too isn't just a gimmick, but an additional layer of challenge that is well explored even in early access, and I find that to be especially important because we need to know and have the expectation of why you would choose to have such a unique concept like that. Being on an ever-moving creature means that you must adapt and plan accordingly, whether that means adjusting which crop we should grow due to the biome we will soon encounter, or planning for a battle against the poisonous plant forest up ahead because Onbu's lack of trust may have led us down a perilous route. All of that is there in early access. And with all that said, let's have a look at the roadmap. In short, they plan for a host of quality of life improvements, more content in the way of new biomes, new locations and events, and even tameable flying creatures. What I'm most excited about are the introductions of flying merchants and new buildings, because while buildings and resources are mostly simplified because of the game's early state, there are definitely more building ideas that could be explored when thinking about creating and preserving an ecosystem on Onbu's back. You know, with all that out of the way, it's safe to say that Strayfon Studios is hard at work updating the game, and if you want to learn more, follow them on Discord and on their YouTube channel. Highly recommend. Alright, so I've got problems. Like actual problems.
Laugh with me!
Aside from being a head case, I do have some issues that I kind of want to talk about, but they're just gripes, small gripes, baby gripes. And it's more on the UI design versus the lack of content. Now again, early access makes it difficult to make strong criticisms, especially because, to be honest, they've made such a solid start. However, quality of life improvements, I think, should be top consideration. While mid-game and late-game content are still in the works and definitely lacking in early access, I think accessibility is a good place to start when it comes to strengthening their UI design, thus allowing players to hone their intended gameplay loop. So a main area of concern that I have is when you're working with limited space on Onbu's back, you have to consider build areas that are most efficient for your city building. Now, it seems like the general approach of this game is not to be too punishing when it comes to city design and even survival. There are options to make this game really friendly to those who don't want villagers to die or even Onbu to die, which, if I'm being honest, I don't consider that hindering, especially because it is optional and not a default setting. I should also mention that I was never really needing of every surface area of Onbu's back, which is less of a complaint as that leads to more ideas as the game develops, but just an observation. However, having played this game on veteran difficulty, getting the ideal building placement can be an issue. Thankfully, right now it's not that big of a deal to replace or move buildings even if you waste resources. However, I imagine as the game progresses and more balancing takes place, mistakes like that will prove more costly. And I think some ways to mitigate that is to have UI that sort of leans into and supports a more proactive player, like allowing for a planning tool that lets us graph and mark square spaces before we plot them, something similar to RimWorld, and perhaps a way to know how many square spaces a building requires somewhere on the building UI, possibly as a tooltip, perhaps something akin to Stranger Crusader Things 3.
You are dumb.
That way we can skip the constant clicking on the building menu and then hovering it over the map. That would be a huge time saver and our mouse would thank you. Also, I think certain buildings need to be reapproached in terms of how many square spaces they occupy. So this is going to sound a little weird and complicated. I'm going to be using words like square spaces and buildings a lot, but hang with me here. For example, the farm building takes considerable space, which makes sense because up to 5 villagers can occupy and work in the building. However, something like the village doctor's building, which can hold up to 3 villagers, or even the researcher's building that can hold up to 2 villagers, share the same square space as, let's say, the worker's post that can hold up to 5 villagers. Having a good sense of consistency when it comes to scaling, i.e. villager to building square space size, may help with gleaning more information about a given building type and may help with understanding population management and give better visual feedback to the player. And perhaps these designs and assets would make better sense if a building scaled upwards and were upgradable. I guess what I'm trying to say in too many words is that some buildings take up way too much space for too few workers. And there's some buildings that can hold a lot of workers that don't take a lot of space on the map, but perhaps that's just a design choice. Another thing I'd like to see revisited is the Buildings tab. As it stands right now, to build anything you need to access it from the bottom bar. This is okay for now, but I wonder if that can become more clunky as more buildings and features are introduced, especially because some buildings, and this could very well be a me problem, can be hard to tell apart. What I think could be helpful is clicking on an already existing structure on the map and having the option to create a copy or duplicate it. Another nifty thing I'd like to see is, highlighting existing buildings. I found that some buildings to look kind of samey and sometimes difficult to find on the map sometimes. Again, probably a me thing, but I think highlighting buildings would be helpful. Perhaps double clicking on one structure highlights all existing structures, that kind of thing. And generally, I think the research tree can also use some rework, especially when it comes to looking at it from a learning perspective. And I do want to say that there's a really strong tutorial, so give that a shot as well. However, that aside, if you're skipping the tutorial and jumping right into it, there's a couple of buildings that I think could be reevaluated when as to their availability. For example, one quick thing I can think of is the mycologist farm building. The mycologist farm is given to you right away with no research, and with it you can grow mushrooms, and mushrooms are used later to create feed for Onbu. However, the Onbu kitchen that processes the mushroom is behind a research path. So without it, the mycologist building is just sorta there. As of right now, you can't do anything else with mushrooms except go to Burning Man. I suppose from a meta perspective, especially at higher difficulties, rushing the mycologist farm is a good thing to do and build right away, to have mushrooms planned ahead for when you do research for the Onbu kitchen. However, in terms of learning the system, it can feel a bit overwhelming because you just have a bunch of unresearched buildings that do things but sort of are dead end in terms of what they actually produce. Strangely, I'd argue that you should probably have the mycologist farm behind a research that leads to the Onbu kitchen, or perhaps is unlocked at the same time. Likewise, there's the herb farm that only serves to utilize the village doctor and the Onbu doctor building. Now, thinking about it, maybe you could make use of both the herb and the mushroom as low-yield food resource that can come in handy during desperate times, or maybe the herb farm can work where you can still apply, medicinal use to it, but it's less effective than having a village doctor use it, that kind of thing. I don't know, I'm spitballing. I just criticize games and play them. Lastly, we need more Onbu immersion. We need more Onbu as a character. Onbu, why did you make that choice? Onbu, what are your motivations going into this story? What do you think of the plot, Onbu? I think I'd like to see more of a response and reason for Onbu when it comes to keeping your villagers on its back. Right now, it seems very much like you're babysitting Onbu, doing your best to keep it alive as you progress, and there are times when, without player intervention, Onbu can literally starve itself to death or wander through a poisonous forest all on its own. And the poisonous forest thing I can kinda understand, as it is a new phenomena, lore-wise, but there are instances that have you thinking, how did this creature live for this long? In fact, I'm really curious about the Onbu AI. I couldn't really find too much on it right now. Like, if it was starving, would it race through its own to find its regular feeding spots? Hasn't happened in my playthroughs, but does it have a traditional migration pattern? Either way, we do so much for Onbu that I wonder what's planned when it comes to Onbu doing things for your villagers. Right now, there's no real gifts or tacit boon. I mean, you could argue lore-wise that Onbu, gives your villagers a way to survive just by being on its back, but it just feels a little more one-sided as of right now and not quite symbiotic, which I know is the intention. So I'm just curious, as trust develops, if Onbu will have a noticeable vested interest in keeping the villagers alive. Conclusion time. We're wrapping up. Aside from some early balancing issues and my surface level UI gripes, which I'm sure will be fixed as part of their quality of life updates, The Wandering Village is pretty solid. A pretty solid out of 10. A pretty solid out of 5. A pretty solid out of all the review scores that accompany reviewing a game. I enjoy it. I really like it, and I'm having a lot of fun with it right now, even at its current build. So much so that I'm planning to do a 100-day challenge on veteran mode. So, shameless plug, that's what I'm doing. Look forward to that. I know I am terrible. Why do I plug myself on my own channel? Last thing, I really feel I should mention its pricing. Now, okay, as it stands right now in the early access review, the game on Steam is $24.99 USD. So I think we should be mindful when talking about the pricing because they are an indie dev team versus other development studios out there. However, as I'm sure you've all heard plenty of times in this new era of early access gaming, be wary of how you spend your money, okay? I often look at games, early access games, that I buy and invest to as a sort of like trust to the developer, that I trust where it's headed, I trust that it'll be completed, and I like what I see so far. All that said, as mentioned at the top of the video, I did receive this game for free, and quite frankly, that was an opportunity that came as a shock to me, quite honestly. However, I would have paid for the game anyway. You know, I trust Straphon Studios to do right by us, and I get the sense of security from having played Niche, their prior game, and knowing what that community is like, and how for a significant time after the launch of Niche, it was still being worked on and developed and improved. So I have that initial trust there, but that is very anecdotal for me to look at it, and I would encourage you there, I'm encouraging you to watch other videos and reviews from folks that you trust, as well as Let's Plays that, you know, key you in to what to expect, okay? So all in all, I think The Wandering Village is worth it, like super worth it. But you may not, which I think is the story of every opinionated video that is out on the internet. Seriously though, I am enjoying my time with it, from its art style to the gameplay and the music and its potential, the plenty that there is. How many times can I hammer that phrase to death? But if anything I just said appeals to you, perhaps consider it. Or at the very least, be the first to comment down below for a key. And that's it. That's all I have for you. But I'll leave you with this. I'm really excited where this game is headed, and I hope you are too. Okay? Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you for watching. I don't know how to end my videos. I feel like I should say something snazzy. Oh yeah, I'm making... On September 14th, in the year of our soul cycle, early... Stupid.